Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I hope this morning finds you safe and well. We are now back for part three of the Escape from Furnace lockdown read through. Alex is talking about how he first became a criminal. He broke into a house with his best friend Toby. The house wasn't empty, it was full of these giants in black suits with silver eyes and this horrible, twisted figure with a gas mask on its face. Toby, Alex's friend, gets shot and killed, and Alex is now on the run. Very important part before we start. Tea. On the run. What's the most scared you've ever been? Maybe at night after a horror film, lying under your blankets, convinced there's a monster in the room. Or one day in the city when you were younger, realising you've lost sight of your mum and dad. Perhaps face to face on the playground with someone who wants to beat the living crap out of you. Multiply those feelings by 1,000,000 and you get me on a dark, wet night, running as fast as I could on the slippery streets to escape the people who'd shot my best friend. I didn't know which direction I was heading in. I just needed to get away, as far away from that house as possible. And I ran until my legs felt like they were made of lead, until my lungs were on fire and my heart stuttered and stammered like it was about to give out. Then I collapsed by the side of the road, my wheezing sobs so loud that people in the nearby houses actually pulled back their curtains to see what was going on. But nobody came out to help me, and I didn't blame them. When you've committed a few crimes, something about you changes. It's like you've been marked with a tattoo that only other people can see, and it makes them wary so that they cross the street to avoid you. Even now, as helpless as a newborn baby, my tears conspiring with the rain to soak my jeans, I knew I was alone. And I also knew that I couldn't stay out in the open. If what the man had said to me was true, then they were trying to frame me for murder. And that wasn't just a slapped wrist or a month or two in juvie, that was life in prison. In furnace, with its pits and its punishment and its pain. Pushing to my feet, I looked at the road sign to get my bearings, realising that my school wasn't too far from here. I took a deep, shuddering breath and started jogging again, making my way down Bryan Avenue and across an abandoned Trafford Road into the row houses that ran along the back of East Mark High. Toby, Brandon and I had stuck into school this way countless times to play soccer on the field. I realised that Toby would never play soccer again, and the thought was like a punch to the gut. But I fought back the tears, tried to push the image of my dead friend from my mind as I cut through an overgrown garden and climbed over the worn fence into the dark, deserted field beyond. I didn't learn the word irony until much later, but I guess it was ironic that I ended up walking across the slick grass to the jungle gym, which rose from the wispy layer of pre-dawn mist like the rusted hull of some ghost ship. It was here that everything had started to go wrong. It had only been 2 years since I stole my first cash, but it seemed like forever. I could barely even picture me before that day, a young boy who had never had a bad thought in his life, who wanted to grow up to be a magician, who couldn't care less about money. I pictured that young boy now, saw him turning his back on his friends and walking off into the sunshine to follow a different path, and I hoped that somewhere, in a different dimension, there was a version of me who wasn't sitting alone on an uncomfortable metal bar in the cold, waiting for the police to lock him away forever. The rain had almost stopped. I climbed a little higher to the platform at the top of the jungle gym and leaned against the rail, looking out across the misty field, eerie in the bright moonlight. Every now and again the glow would be shrouded by a passing rain cloud, throwing the whole world into darkness. Each time it happened, I was gripped by terror, the fear that a monstrous dark figure would rise from the fog and snatch me up, carry me away. But the moon always fought back, bathing the field and its sole inhabitant in its liquid silver. My options were few and far between. I could sit here and wait for morning, when the school would be full of people all looking for me. I could head home, surely the news about Toby's death wouldn't have broken yet, and I could talk to my mum and dad about what had happened. I could head to Brandon's house, hide out there until I thought of a better plan. I could run, head for the hills and never look back. Or I could just go to the police, tell them what had really gone on in that house. I mean, there were 6 giant men and a freak in a gas mask. Somebody else must have seen them. None of those options seemed particularly appealing, so I put them in order of how bad they were. Running seemed like the worst thing I could do, closely followed by waiting here and going to the police. That left Brandon and my own home. I thought about seeing my mum again, and it filled me with a strange mix of sadness and joy. Maybe she could just give me a hug and all this would go away. Surely mums had the power to make anything go away. But the thought of confessing to her was almost as unbearable as the thought of a lifetime inside Furness. It would have to be Brandon's. I was so lost in the thought that I didn't notice the change in light until it was almost too late. Looking at my jeans, I saw they were shimmering with a red and blue haze, not unlike a disco light. But this was no disco. I snatched my head up to see 2 police cars sitting 100 metres away outside the school's main gate, casting a web of colour across the dark grass. Several armoured men were climbing out of the vehicles, most equipped with rifles and flashlights, and one holding what looked like a bolt cutter. They walked to the gates, the cop with the cutters using them to snap through the heavy chain before kicking them open. He pointed at the school building, and 2 of the police with flashlights started running towards it. Then he scanned the playing field, his eyes coming to rest on my jungle gym. He gestured my way. I ducked behind the rail as 2 beams of light struck the metal frame, seeking me out. There wasn't much cover, but the police were too far away to see me. Not for long, though. As I watched, the 2 men started jogging across the grass in my direction. I shuffled backwards across the platform until I reached the far edge, ready to drop down to the ground. But before I could, my eye caught a piece of graffiti that I swear had never been there before. Carved into the soft wood of the platform, in large, even letters, were 3 words that made my blood freeze. Keep running, Alex. Get the page over and ready to. I traced my fingers across the markings to make sure they were real, but the sensation of splinters in my skin let me know that this was no dream. The men, whoever they were, had known what I'd do before I did. The sound of footsteps pounding the wet grass reminded me that the police were getting closer. I shoved myself off the rear of the frame, landing awkwardly on the soft ground and backing into the darkness. Turning, I sprinted towards the fence, forcing my tired legs to work. Scrambling out into the overgrown garden, I scanned the street to make sure it was empty, then turned left and started walking towards Brandon's house. I hadn't spoken to Brandon much since Toby and I had started robbing houses instead of students. It was as if he could see that invisible tattoo too, and it was pretty clear from the way he acted now that he was scared of us, of what we'd become. But we'd been close friends once, and even when you've been to hell and back, your friends stick by you. I cut up Edwards Avenue, taking another left at the top of the hill and making my way towards Bessemer Road. The houses in this part of town were all huge, their 4 stories staring out across the tract housing below like they were laughing at them. I guess that's one of the reasons Brandon had backed out. Even though his parents only owned an apartment up here, they weren't exactly poor. Not that I was stealing bread so that I could stay alive. I'm no Oliver Twist. I spotted the building that Brandon's apartment was in and crossed the road, trying to stick to the blanket of shadows that kept most of the street in darkness. All the lights were off, which wasn't surprising given that it was long after midnight, but I knew which room was his. Sneaking in through the front gate, I picked up a couple of small stones from the gravelled path and pulled back my arm to launch them at the 2nd floor window. Before I could, something grabbed my wrist. A vice-like grip that felt like it could have torn the whole limb off. I yelped as much from the shock as the pain and spun around to see a horribly familiar face standing right behind me, his silver eyes glinting, the same tiny mole on his chin and his soulless smile beaming at me like the Cheshire Cat's. It was impossible. He hadn't been there seconds before, and nobody could move that quickly, that quietly. "Didn't your mother tell you to never throw stones?" the man in the suit asked, his voice so powerful that it felt as if it was being transmitted right into the centre of my brain. I couldn't respond. My whole body felt numb. The man tightened his grip on my arm, bending down until his face was almost touching mine. "Not long till sunrise, Alex," he said, the scent of his breath like sour milk. "And now you've got these guys to deal with." He twisted my wrist, spinning me around and giving me a shove that propelled me back out of the gate. I tripped on my own feet, staggering backward off the curb and landing in a heap on the road. I glanced up just in time to see a police car slam on its brakes, squealing to a stop seconds before its front bumper made friends with my forehead. I looked back to Brandon's garden, but it was empty. The man in black had vanished just as quickly as he had appeared. I heard the sound of car doors opening and I leaped to my feet, backing away from the vehicle. A policeman in beetle black body armour was making his way towards me, his expression one of concern. A policewoman held back, one hand on her radio, the other on the nasty-looking nightstick that hung from her belt. "You okay?" the man asked, stepping closer. "You just came out of nowhere. Did we hit you?" I kept on retreating, my eyes flitting back and forth from the man to the woman. Her radio bleeped, the sound filling the whole street before a voice spoke from the static. I couldn't make out what it said, but I knew from the way she looked at me that it wasn't good. "It's him!" she shouted, wrenching the stick from her belt and advancing. Her partner's expression instantly morphed into one of anger, and he pounced, leaping towards me. Up until tonight, I'd have thought he was a big guy, and quick too, but compared with the men in black, the cop looked tiny, and his move was sluggish. I darted to my left, angling my body so that his hands missed me. Then I swiveled, pushing him square in the back and sending him sprawling onto the wet road. His partner shrieked at me to stop, vaulting over the car's hood with her nightstick held high, ready to knock me into next week. I don't know how I did it, but somehow I managed to start running again. You must remember how your legs feel after running laps in gym class, when they're so exhausted that it seems like you're running underwater. That was how it felt, leaping back onto the pavement and hurtling down that road, trying to hold off the sobs so that I could breathe. When I look back, I'm remembering that policewoman who only chased me to the end of the street before returning to her car. It doesn't seem too bad. I mean, I've run screaming from far worse things since that night. Creatures that never stop chasing you. There was only one place left to go, and I headed there at full pelt. I don't remember the journey. It was as if my brain had shut down so that all my energy could be directed to my feet. And I couldn't stop running, even when I reached my house. If I kept moving, then nobody could catch me. Not the police who were gathered outside, not the men in black suits who were waiting in the shadows, watching everything through silver eyes. If I could just make it inside, then all the bad things would go away. So I didn't stop. Not when the police started shouting, not when officers in black masks and bulletproof vests ran into the street with rifles, not when my mum came running out of the front door, dressed in her pink nightie and slippers, screaming at me to give myself up. I just put my head down and cried to her with all my strength. I don't know how I even managed to stay upright. The world was spinning so fast, but I made it past the first policeman, my sheer momentum sending him flying. The second backed out of my way, his expression of shock almost comical. I could see my mum, tears streaming down her face, being held back by 2 police officers. I could see the open door behind her, the warm glow of the kitchen. If I could just make it, 10 more steps, then maybe all this could end. Maybe I could find Daniel Richards and give him his money back. It was only 20 quid. I hit the third policeman square on. He was built like a fire plug, all chest and shoulders, and I bounced off, the wind knocked out of me. I charged forwards again, but it was too much. My legs cramped, and I dropped to my knees for the second time that night. I reached out to my mum, and she reached out to me. But the air between us was instantly flooded with black uniforms, blotting her out like flies. Then I was on the ground, strangers' knees in my back, their nightsticks against my skull, and sharp metal around my wrists. "I didn't do it," I sobbed. "I didn't do it." But I couldn't even lift my head from the sidewalk, and with the weight of the world on my shoulders, only the cold, wet concrete beneath me heard my denial. Got time for one more chapter? Tea. Okay. Denial and damnation. I didn't do it. It seemed like the only thing I said for the next few days, a kind of mantra that I kept pumping out as a defence against all the questions and accusations. The first ones at my throat were the cops who threw me into a van, whose taunts and threats cut into me with far more force than the cuffs that bound me to the seat. How could you do it? I didn't do it. He was your friend. I didn't do it. Well, you're going to pay, kid. I didn't do it. Next, it was the detectives. They started nice like they always do in the movies, offering deals and leniency if I just confessed. But the more I denied it, the harder they got. Their questions so relentless that by the third day, when they were kicking over my chair and blowing cigarette smoke in my face, I barely knew whether I was guilty or not. Then came Toby's parents, who sat on the other side of a table, clutching each other and screaming at me, their eyes burning with more hatred than I had ever seen in anyone, their anger only held in check by the cops who rested hands on their quivering shoulders and told them I'd get what was coming to me. By this time, my mantra was a whisper, little more than a breath, but I kept saying it, because, like a breath, it was the only thing keeping me alive. The worst questions came from the people I loved, my mum and dad. I was separated from them by a dirty plastic window, but there was far greater barrier between us. I could tell by the way my mum couldn't meet my eye that she thought I was guilty, and she refused to listen to my pleas just like everybody else. There may as well have been a gorge between us, or a mountain, and by the time she was guided out of the room by my dad's unsteady hands, I couldn't even find the energy to whisper my denials. For 3 weeks, I endured an interrogation every day and was thrown into a cell each night. Of course, I told them everything that had happened, the men in the black suits, the sinister figure in the gas mask, the way they'd shot Toby in cold blood, but even as I was talking, the words seemed ludicrous, hollow. I didn't blame them for laughing at me. I'd have never believed my story either, if I hadn't lived the nightmare myself. My trial was an extension of the same empty process. I was marched into court with an armed escort and chained inside a cage, the kind better suited to serial killers and military generals accused of war crimes, not terrified kids. The heavy bars didn't stop the hatred directed at me when the hearing began. It poured through like ice water from a judge who was already convinced I was a killer, from a jury that had made up its mind about this case as soon as it started, and from the crowd in the public gallery who bayed for my punishment like hyenas. I felt like I was drowning in their contempt and just prayed for it to be over, even if it meant sinking without a trace. My spirits were lifted only once, when midday through the second day, the doors of the courtroom opened and 2 men strode through. Dressed in black and larger than life, they were instantly recognisable. The men who'd sent me here. The room fell silent as soon as they entered, even the judge lowering his voice from respect, or maybe fear. "That's them!" I shouted as they took their seats. "They're the men who framed me! They killed Toby!" But the judge simply banged his gavel and fixed me with a contemptuous stare. "Of course they are," he said, his voice oily with sarcasm. "These men are representatives from Furnace Penitentiary. Is this what your defence has come to, accusing anybody of your crimes? Was I there? Did I have a disagreement with your accomplice and pull the trigger too?" The jury laughed, and the men in black suits unveiled their shark grins and flashed their silver eyes at me. I was like a fish on the end of a line, waiting to be reeled in. It took the jury less than 40 minutes to decide my fate. 12 men and women in a room with my life in their hands, and they condemned me in less time than the first half of a soccer match. Not that I'm trying to pass the buck. I hadn't killed Toby, but his blood was on my hands, just like the blood was on his. My blood was on his. If we hadn't been so stupid, then none of this would have happened. We'd both have been at school just like any other day, tormenting teachers, just being kids. I'll never forget the judge's closing speech, when the jury announced the guilty verdict. He stood, his walnut desk like a pulpit, and his booming voice and thrashing limbs like those of a preacher damning the devil. "Your crimes are heinous and unforgivable. he shouted, the flecks of foam around his mouth visible even from where I was standing. Like so many of today's youth, you have taken your life and squandered it, turning to crime instead of honour, sickness instead of decency. You have killed in cold blood. You are a coward and a thief and a murderer, and like all the other festering wastes of society who come through this court, I am happy to sentence you without remorse and without pity. He leaned forward, never taking his eyes off me. You knew very well when you pulled that trigger what your punishment would be, he hissed. There is no longer any leniency for child offenders, not since the summer of slaughter. And like those murderous teenagers, you will never again see the light of day. If it was up to me, I would see you hanged by the neck until you were dead. But alas, I must settle for this. He paused again, smiling wickedly to himself. Or perhaps settle is the wrong word. Perhaps this is a fate even worse. I knew what was coming. I clenched my fingers around the bars, praying one last time that something would happen to end this sick and twisted dream. But it was too late. It was over. Alex Sawyer, I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment at the Furnace Penitentiary with no possibility of parole. You will be taken from here this afternoon and incarcerated for the rest of your days. The resulting wave of cheers and shouts, the banging of the gavel and the roaring in my ears as the truth sank in, drowned out the only thing I could think of to say. I didn't do it. I don't remember much else about that day. I have a vague recollection of being dragged from the courtroom by the armed guards, the men in black holding open the door and telling me once again that they'd see me very soon. I couldn't quite remember how to use my legs, so they literally pulled me along the marble-clad corridors, past the crowds with their expressions of hatred and disgust, past my own parents, whose faces I could not make out because they turned away. I recall only one thing with any clarity. As I was passing a second courtroom, the doors flew open to reveal another boy, a similar age to me, being hauled kicking and screaming from inside. He was giving the bailiffs a hard time, his flailing body sending one crashing to the floor and causing the other to reach for his taser. With a flash, 50,000 volts sent the boy hurtling across the corridor, leaving him in a groaning, smoking pile. But even then, I could make out his protests, and they sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't me, he whispered as the men picked him up. It wasn't me. For the briefest of seconds, our eyes met. It was like looking into a mirror. The fear, the panic, the defiance. I knew instantly that what had happened to me had also happened to him. Our dark fates entwined by the same men. Our lives broken by an identical deception. And then he was gone. I was carried down the corridor, my memories of the moment lessening with each step and fading away completely as I climbed into the truck that would take me to my new home, to the place I would spend the rest of my life, to my own personal hell, to Furnace. Okay, it's getting exciting. Not as exciting as my tea. I'll see you tomorrow. Stay safe, stay well, and yeah, look after yourselves.